Here's a video on the Golden Age of Greece, particularly focusing in philosophy and theater. So we start looking at this in philosophy. Let's see. We can start, before we start talking about the philosophers themselves, we know philosophers means lovers of wisdom, and their roots are kind of in this group of people called the cosmologists. Not to be confused with cosmetologists who do beauty makeup. Cosmologists, people that wanted to understand the natural order of the universe. So these are people that had said, we've accepted supernatural explanations of events for too long, and there must be some natural cause of things. Why is there thunder? It's not because Zeus is mad. Oops, let me change that. Not natural order of events, natural order of universe. We're not going to accept that there's thunder because Zeus is mad. We're not going to assume that things happen because of God's will it. So there must be some natural order of the universe. So they're looking for, we might say, rational explanations. Rational explanations for why things happen. And some of these people, you think about this cosmologists, and think about the word cosmologist, by the way, too, right? Studying of, the cosmos, or the universe. So they want to know why things happen. Some of the big names we have for cosmologists, we have Thales. Is a big one. Thales was someone that, again, looked for natural explanations. He started studying geometry, started looking for scientific explanations of things. One of the more interesting things he does, if you love geometry, is that he studied the pyramids. And if you can imagine, well, he didn't study the pyramids so much, but he wanted to know how tall the pyramids were. So how does he do that? Well, in ancient Greece, there wasn't equipment to be able to measure elevation and things like that. So he stood, let's draw a picture of Thales here. He stood somewhere near the pyramids, and when the sun started to shine and his shadow, he marked how tall he was. When his shadow got to the point where it was his height, he knew that this was his height. He had one of his assistants measure the shadow of the pyramid. So he was able to say, well, if this is how tall I am, this is how, and my shadow is equal to it, this must be how tall the pyramids are because their shadow is equal to the pyramids. So, that's a geometric theorem. That's a way of trying to understand the world. I think geometry is really the measure of the world. We think about it as shapes and stuff like that, and theorems and proofs. But geometry essentially is a measurement of the world. So Thales was looking to do that, wanted to understand, how big the pyramids were and the natural order of the universe. You have other greats like Pythagoras. We all know our Pythagorean theorem. And he's somebody that said there must be he thought there was a mathematical order to the universe. We have other ones like Democritus, who believed that the world was made up of smaller structures. He didn't necessarily think of atoms and cells like we do because, without, microscopes and things like that, he wouldn't know of that stuff. But he did believe that the world is made up of smaller pieces of, particles of matter, and that's what made up everything else. So you can think about these guys. What's important about them is not always necessarily remembering what they talked about. Pythagorean theorem is great and all, but for this class is that they were looking for rational explanations, right? They wanted to understand how the universe worked. And a lot of them are wrong. Aristotle did a lot of this too. He wanted to understand why, what the natural state of an object was. So he said that if you throw a rock, the rock's going to eventually fall. So here's Aristotle. He throws a rock, and the rock eventually is going to fall to earth and come to rest. And he said, well, the natural state of things must be rest, because the rock, every time you throw it, if you shoot an arrow, they always end up stopping. The natural state of an object must be at rest because they always end up stop moving. And that's not true. We know this rock stops because of gravity and friction and things like that. But so Aristotle's wrong, as were so a lot of the other guys that were wrong about some of the stuff they talked about. Some of them are right, but whether they're wrong or not, their idea is that they're looking for natural explanations for the universe. There's another group of people during this time called the Sophists, and these were people that actually Socrates, when we talk about philosophers, had problems with them. The Sophists believed that the art of rhetoric, so you put that up here, rhetoric, the art of public speaking, and winning an argument was more important than the truth, right? You might think victory is more important than the truth. This is the art of public speaking. And, to them, the art of public speaking was winning an argument, even if you were arguing something that was wrong. It wasn't about trying to determine what the truth was of a matter. It was more about persuasion and using, rhetoric to get your way. Think about this as a problem. We saw this with with the Athenian assembly, that when you have uneducated people voting, like in the assembly, you can have someone using rhetoric to try to win over arguments and try to gain power. And we called this person a demagogue. There's a fear of demagoguery, a leader of the people, right? Dema of the people, gog, leader, but this is a negative connotation. This would be someone that used their persuasion and their rhetoric to try to gain power and influence from the people. So these sophists used rhetoric, and they're often associated with the idea of moral relativism, which is something you may be familiar with. Moral relativism is the idea that there are no rights and wrongs, universal rights and wrongs. Relativism, I spelled that wrong, looks wrong. Relativism, I don't think there's an E in there, relativism. There we go. There's no universal right or wrong. What's wrong for me might be right for you, and vice versa. What's wrong for our city-state might be wrong for another city-state, or our country versus another country. That it's really up to the individual or society to determine what's right or wrong. So, these sophists would often take money for teaching, and they would emphasize, the persuasion and trying to capture someone else in an argument. Well, the person that has a problem with this, someone that we see, is Socrates, right? Socrates, not the first of the philosophers, but the first of the big three: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Socrates was essentially kind of like a homeless teacher. He wandered around, didn't teach for pay. He just taught to whoever listened to him, wandered the streets and had conversations with people. He used what they call the Socratic method, although he didn't call it that, but the Socratic method was asking questions, having a dialogue, trying to understand the truth of things. And what Socrates believed was that there are some absolute truths, some universal truths. Some things are universally or absolutely right. So that goes in against the sophist, the idea of moral relativism, right? He believed in absolute truths, moral absolutism in a sense. Some things are always right no matter what. And it doesn't matter how you argue them, they're still right or they're still wrong, one of the two. So Socrates wandered around and talked to anybody that would listen to him. Socrates, his famous quote was, "Know thyself," and the unexamined life is not worth living. So really trying to understand yourself so you can understand the world around it. Socrates, we don't have any writings of him because he didn't write stuff down. So what we know of Socrates comes from people that lived near him, around him. Most likely Plato is one of our greatest sources because he's one of the students. Socrates, we know, was eventually executed by the Athenian assembly. And the story of that is that, in a nutshell, executed. That during the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens was not having a great time of it against Peloponnesia. And the demagogue in the assembly had convinced the assembly that the best thing to do was to send an Athenian fleet to Syracuse to attack them. And it was a disastrous move. The army was trapped in Syracuse, captured. About 30,000 Athenians were sold into slavery and taken prisoner. It was an absolute disaster. And that really was kind of the end of the Athenian greatness with the Peloponnesian War. Well, Socrates, or should I say the Athenians, wanted someone to blame for this, right? How could this be? How could Athens have fallen so far? It can't. The leaders didn't want to take responsibility for it, so they blamed Socrates. Socrates, why they picked him? Well, they needed a scapegoat. They needed to basically put the blame on somebody. And Socrates was very critical of Athenian democracy. He thought that people would choose bad leaders, that the system was bad. He mocked the actual leaders of Athens, the people making decisions, thought they were inept. So they took it out on him, basically. They said that he was corrupting the youth, not respecting the gods, but really what it was is they wanted to silence him. We have a picture here of the death of Socrates, the execution of Socrates. They put him on trial. The Athenian assembly, let me change that. There we go. The Athenian assembly, people would vote. Everyone could stand up and have a say. And in a case like this, Socrates was allowed to defend himself. They using a water clock, so they timed him. He had a certain amount of time to speak. But he didn't defend himself in a sense that would get him off. He mocked the Athenians. He said that basically he was going to continue to irritate and agitate because the Athenians needed someone to push him in the right direction. And when he was asked to apologize and take back what he said, he refused to and said instead that the Athenians should buy him dinner for the rest of his life because he's done such a great service to the Athenians. And you see in this picture that Socrates is he's about to drink hemlock. So let me see. Well, the writing's on top of that. Let me erase some of this. So we have Socrates here. He's about to drink some of the hemlock. They give him a liquefied virgin hemlock, which is poison. It's supposed to be incredibly excruciating to drink. And he's not hesitating. His student here, Phaedo, is weeping. Plato's over here. He can't even watch what's going on. But Socrates is not afraid to drink the hemlock. You see the chains that made him a prisoner are down here symbolically. He's been freed by the truth, right? He's pointing to the truth. There's some things worth dying for. I'd rather die for my principles than live a lie. So he's willing to drink the hemlock, and he's executed. This has a devastating effect, as you can imagine, on Plato, his student, who was very upset about this. So Socrates is executed by the Athenian assembly. If we look at the next two philosophers, we got, let's see, Plato and Aristotle. And this picture from the School of Athens, painted by Raphael during the Renaissance, has Plato over to our left. So we'll put Plato over here. And we have Aristotle on our right. And it's neat when you look at some of these paintings that nothing is really just there. Everything has a meaning. So if we look at this picture of Plato, like Socrates in the death of Socrates, is pointing to the sky. And it's worth noting this painting of the death of Socrates is painted in the 1780s by Jacques-Louis David. So it's painted almost 2,000 years later. So it's looking back at it, and some people might ask, why does Socrates look so strong? It's a style and muscular because he was like a 7-year-old homeless guy. This was a style of the painting where you painted everyone in their, it's almost in their perfect classical form. So this painting is painted by painted by Raphael, and you see Plato here pointing to the heavens, much like Socrates, showing his connection to Socrates, but also it's partially because of what Plato believed. So we can look at some different things here as far as his belief system, or what he wrote about. Plato did write things down. He wrote in dialogues mostly. Towards the end, he stopped writing in dialogues, but all of his dialogues had Socrates as the main person talking and discussing things. And so it's tough sometimes to tell what was Socrates and what was Plato. Was Plato just, kind of passing on what Socrates taught? But the further we go into reading Plato, the more we know, or we can assume that it was more and more his ideas. So he writes in dialogues, and the most famous of the books we're going to talk about is The Republic. And The Republic is his work where he describes the ideal society and the ideal government, the Republic, Plato's Republic. He basically is describing what we call today a utopia, right? The ideal place. Although we might disagree about what he said was the perfect place and what was utopia. So for this Republic, he talks about things like the ideal society. So how would he structure society? He says, well, and think about this, a lot of this stuff is critical of Athens, even though he's not directly criticizing Athens. By saying that the ideal place is nothing like Athens, he's indirectly saying that Athens is not very great. So his society was based on the social classes. At the top would be philosophers. In the middle would be warriors. And at the bottom would be producers. So in this society, people would do what they were best suited for, right? So they wouldn't get to choose whether they want to be warriors, philosophers, or producers. Basically, children would be watched. They'd be born of parents, and they'd be watched at young ages. And if they seemed like they were more fitted to be warriors because they were strong, fast, and brave, then they would be, in a sense, kind of sent off to train with warriors. If they seem to be particularly intelligent and rational and problem solving, they might get a different education and be trained to be philosophers. And everybody else would be producers, farmers, manufacturers, artisans, things like that. People didn't, in Plato's idea, people wouldn't have a choice. They would do what they were best suited for. So if you didn't want to be a warrior, too bad, because that's what you're suited for. You should be a warrior. And the idea of Plato was that people, in the end, even though they have no choice, would be happier, because if you were a warrior and you're weak and cowardly, how happy would you be if you said, I want to be a warrior, but you were terrible at it? You'd never find happiness seeking something you weren't good at, so you'd be better suited to be a producer or something else. So he has this idea of the society, and they said that they would, they would tell a lie to the people that the gods put different blood in different people's veins, so you really shouldn't go against the gods. But essentially, it would organize society this way. And at the top of the society is, you think about his government, he believes in philosopher kings. So philosophers should run the show, and the kings should be philosophers because they are thinking critically. And really, where this comes from, what this is rooted in, is what he calls, or at least how he justifies it. He starts with talk about the allegory of the cave, which you may have heard before in another class. Allegory of the cave. So if we're going to describe the allegory of the cave, you think about, he basically, again, he's telling a story and a lie to make people understand what he's talking about. Not so much a lie, but like a myth. So in this allegory of the cave, you'd have some people, I'll draw them in yellow. Some people would be staring at a wall. So there's a guy sitting here. They're sitting and they're kind of chained up, and he's looking this way. And at the wall, there's shadows. There's like a big light cast upon the wall, and there's shadows of, let's say, a bird. And he's watching this thinking this is real life. But really what's going on is there's a wall behind him, and behind him are people that have puppets that are shaped like birds, and there's a fire. So a big fire blaring that's casting light, that's making a shadow. So you have some people behind this wall that are doing a puppet show in essence, and a fire. This is supposed to be fire over here. I'll label that fire. So these people are watching the puppet show, these people down here, and they think that these puppets are real life. They think that shadow of a bird is actually what a bird is because they've never seen anything else because they're being fooled by this. But you might have philosophers. Imagine this is in a cave. A philosopher has left the cave and he's gone out into the daylight. So the sun's out here, right? He's seen the actual sun. And we know that when you walk from a dark place to a sunny place, it's blinding. You squint, you can't open your eyes, you sneeze. So the philosopher might go out, and other people, if they were to escape the cave, might go out, and they'd be kind of turned off by the sun. It's too bright. They want to go back. But the philosopher would brave that. He'd get through it, and he'd see a real bird flying around. You say, wow, that bird looks different than the bird I saw the shadows in there. That's a real bird. It's colorful. It's quick. It sings songs. It's more movable. It's more animated. So he might see this bird and say, wait a second, that's what a real bird is. And in this allegory of the cave, this philosopher has seen things for what they really are. He tries to go back into the cave and tell everybody that, hey guys, you're looking at you're looking at this bird over here, but that's not a bird. That's a shadow. I saw a real bird. Come look. But these people, they're chained up looking at the shadows, don't want anything to do with it because all they've ever known is this shadow show, right? That's all they want to know. They don't want to be bothered with leaving the cave where it's dangerous and scary and going out into the sun. So according to Plato, these philosopher kings over here, these philosophers would be kings because they have seen the world for what it really is. They know what the real things are, real form of things are. They're not blinded by, sitting in this cave all the time. So this allegory of the cave that explains his idea of why philosophers should be kings, and it kind of goes into this idea of theory of the forms. And this idea of theory of the forms, or realm of the forms, Plato said that just like the philosopher that left the cave, he saw a real bird. Philosophers can, in their mind, understand the true meaning of all the different things in life. So if we think about, for instance, philosophers might say, or people might disagree about what justice is. People in the United States might say justice is, you're not guilty until proven, you're not innocent until proven guilty. You have a jury of your peers. It has to be a speedy trial. You can't be held without, reason, things like that. You can't have excessive bail. That's what we consider justice. You have entitled to a lawyer and legal representation. But if you lived in another country like North Korea, they have a much different sense of justice where none of those things would apply. If you were to talk to an American, they would say, well, our justice system is better. And if you talk to a North Korean, they might say their justice system is better because we're both, in a sense, biased because of what we've always known our system. So Plato would say that, well, same thing with city-states. People from Sparta might think justice is one thing, and Athens might think justice is something else, but the philosopher has, in a sense, left the cave, and we're looking at, if we're living in our country, we're looking at shadows of justice, right? The shadows in the wall, because that's all we've ever known. But the philosopher has left the cave and been able to look at real justice, and is able to come back and say, hey, guys, that's not justice. So because they see this, and this is the theory of the forms, is this realm of abstract forms that only philosophers are intellectually able to get to. They're not bound by their local bias and their regional ideas. That they can actually see true justice, true beauty, the true form of everything. and therefore they should be the rulers that run the city-state. So this is, in essence, his republic, right? And this is, and he also believed in equality of the genders too. That women could equally be philosophers, warriors, and producers. There's no reason why had to all be men. So we have this idea of Plato, right? So that's the republic. So then we look and compare him to Aristotle. We notice Aristotle's hand is down here. Aristotle is more considered the practical philosopher. Because he wasn't concerned necessarily with the ideal society or the ideal government or utopias. He wanted to study what was actually around us and what was the most practical or best form of things. You see his hands kind of like holding it down. He's like, maybe an arrow would be better. He's saying, no, it's more about down here on earth, right? What can we observe? What can we see? What can we draw conclusions from? And the work that for this purpose, we'll look at is the politics. He writes a lot of things. He studies natural science, he studies ethics, but in the politics, he studied different city-states. And he sent out his students, they studied over 150 city-states, and their idea was to look for the best form of government, not the ideal form of government, but the best, practical government, the one that's in practice that works the best, practical government. And when his students came back, they collected all the information, and he ends up finding that the best practical government was a limited democracy that was heavily influenced by a strong middle class. And think about why that is, why he thinks that. He talks about what he calls the doctrine of the mean. And the Greeks would take this idea of the doctrine of the mean and apply it to architecture and art. They call it the golden mean, doctrine of the mean. We know mean is an average, right? So it's somewhere in between the two extremes. So if we think about this, let me go over here. We can look at this doctrine of the mean, and we can imagine that if we have two extremes on a line, let's say we're talking about soldiers. You might say one extreme over on the far left here would be a soldier that is rash and impulsive. And since they're so brave that if there was the enemy was in front of them, they would rush out without thinking. They'd impulsively attack them on their own, and that would lead to bad things because since they attacked out of the phalanx formation and without support, they would be killed by the enemy. The other extreme, of course, would be a coward, someone that doesn't want to fight at all. So we have these two extremes. He says the doctrine of the mean is being somewhere in the middle, right? Not being cowardly, but not being rash, being brave and courageous, but also rational. So he says that's the mean, right? That's the average, and he applies this to other things. He talks about various things. We could maybe look at this instead of with soldiers. We could think about. He talks about drinking wine, but let's talk about, since Halloween's around the corner, let's talk about eating candy. That one extreme would be eat 10 bags of candy. Well, you shouldn't do that because that's going to make you feel terrible. You're going to feel sick and it's not going to be very nutritious. The other extreme is eat no candy. But who wants to do that? Who wants to live a life where you can't eat any candy, right? So you want to be somewhere in the middle. Eat some candy. You might think in moderation. A piece here, a piece there, 1 or 2 pieces a day for dessert or something like that. So this is the idea of the mean, right? We should be somewhere in, this is where we would be happiest if we were somewhere in the mean, in the middle. This would be unhappy, and this would be unhappy. So that's essentially his doctrine of the mean. And he applies that to his government. If we go back to that, the idea of the limited middle class, right? So he says, or the limited democracy of the strong middle class. The middle class, he says, would be best to rule because if you gave power to the poor, he says they would use it to seek revenge and pay back to the wealthy. Like they always resent the wealthy because the wealthy had land and power and the poor had nothing. So they would use that power if you gave it to the poor to get revenge on the rich. He says you can't give power to the rich because they'll use it to protect their wealth and their power. So he says the middle class would be best, right? They have enough wealth where they're not envious of the middle class, I mean the upper class, and they're educated enough and they're industrious enough where they would make a strong ruling group. So again, this practical philosopher versus the ideal philosopher, it's a big difference between the two. Last thing we'll talk about in this video is I want to talk about theater in this golden age. And in Greek theater, we have tragedies and comedies. And when we think about these tragedies and comedies, maybe we could talk about comedies first. So actually, let me move that around there. Let's talk about comedies. Comedy is a little bit different than what we know of today, or what we think of comedy. First of all, the only surviving real comedic playwright from Greece is Aristophanes. There's other comedic playwrights, but as far as surviving works, we have Aristophanes' works. A couple of notable ones: The Clouds. Oops, spelled that wrong. The Clouds and The Frogs. And when we think about comedies with these, they use comedy as more, you might think of satire, to poke fun at people, to poke fun at situations, to poke fun at the government. It wasn't comedies like we might watch The Office, although that kind of does that too. There's some satire in there, but it wasn't so much like slapstick, knee-slapping comedy. It was more, you might think of, for instance, in The Clouds, they mocked Socrates, right? They made fun of Socrates. So they portrayed him and they made him look a little silly for some of the things that he did. They might portray leaders of the country, kind of like you see if you watch Saturday Night Live. They might have people like doing the presidential debates and, someone's mocking each side. They're picking on these extreme parts of their personality and emphasizing them more to make a point. That's kind of what comedy was for the Greeks. Tragedies, we have a lot more surviving plays, and some of our big playwrights are Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus, depends on who you want to believe is how it's pronounced. But they write a bunch of these tragedies. And when we think about tragedies, they usually are talking about human flaws. They emphasize human flaws. Actually, I'm going to write this over here. They would emphasize human flaws and hubris. We know hubris is excessive pride, right? Usually excessive pride that leads to your undoing. So people that are so overconfident or prideful themselves that they have some tragic thing happens to them to show them, to bring them humility. And usually it ends with death, unfortunately, for the for the Greeks in the plays. And human flaws. And what we see in a lot of these plays is kind of the expression of the idea of the soul for the Greeks. The Greeks believe that your soul, at least some of the Greeks, like Plato, believe that your soul is made up of three parts: reason, passion, and will. And they all interacted. So you might think your passion is what drives you, what makes you want to do things. So my passion to eat chocolate candy during Halloween would lead me, if I left my passion unchecked, to eat 10 bags of candy. However, my reason says that's not such a good idea, because using logic and rational thinking, if I eat too much candy, I will be sick, I won't have an appetite, it's not healthy, I'll gain too much weight, my teeth will rot. So my reason says don't do it. How does the reason control the passion? It controls the passion through the will, essentially your willpower. And the Greeks kind of thought about this as almost like they had an image for someone riding a horse, and the horse would be the passion. Here's a horse for you, right? This is the passion. Right, the horse is this big giant animal that you might be riding, and it wants to go where it wants to go. It's because it's much larger than you. The reason is the rider. He's up here on the horse, and the horse might say, "I want to walk over. I want to go check out the highway. Travel down to like Route 16." And that's a terrible thing because there's traffic and the horse will get killed, and so will the rider. So the rider says, we don't want to go to Route 16. That's dangerous. So he has to control the horse, and he controls the horse with the reins, right? So this is kind of like their image for a horse. And I actually read a play. Euripides writes a play, Hippolytus, which is about this a man in a sense whose his undoing is his passion, but it's based around the idea of, has horses as imagery in there. But you think of the horse is the passion that wants to go where it wants to go. The rider is a reason that knows what's best for both of them, and he uses the will, or the reins as the will to control the horse. So this is essentially what we see in a lot of these plays, that people, when their passions get out of control, or their, either passion being anger or lust or, greed or whatever it might be, usually it's their undoing. So all these plays usually end up with the main characters being killed. And we see some of the plays, they have remarkable structures. You see this is the theater at Epidaurus, where these theaters are crazy. They could fit, 10, 12, 13,000 people in them. You can see down here, let's see. Here, actually, keep that open here. So we look in this theater, you can see down in the middle in the circle now. I guess I have to draw around. Let me erase some of this stuff for you. There we go. So you can see down here, this is the orchestra. This is where they theater. Like we think that's where they will play music, but that's a stage. That's where the actors are being. You see, it gives you a sense of the size. There's a person down there. It's how far away they are. So the theater, the action would happen on this orchestra right there, orchestra. Behind it would be a wooden structure typically, or a pit where they would go back for costume changes. We know that only men played roles in a theater, so they played men and female roles, and they would distinguish each other from character by wearing masks and changing costumes. So they would go back into this area back here where they would change into different costumes and get ready for scenery changes. You might think, looking at this, how does somebody that's sitting way back here on this bench here, how is he going to hear someone that's so far away? Well, the Greeks, the way they built this was pretty amazing. First of all, the masks would act as megaphones in some ways. As they were speaking through the mask, it would help amplify their voice naturally. But also these, you could also say the semicircle nature of this, right? There are great acoustics here, so where you're talking, sound is in a sense kept within the semicircle. Since they're talking towards this way, it's going to kind of bounce and reverberate around the semicircle. The other big thing is that they built these stadiums into the sides of hills. So we look at a picture of the amphitheater in Pergamum in current day Asia Minor. So there we go. And first of all, this is they say the steepest of these. This is a pretty steep theater sitting in. If you ever go to like a sporting event, you sit in the balcony, feel like you're right on top of stuff. The orchestra would be down here. So these people are really far away, but it's also built into the side of the hill. So as these people are talking, not only is the semicircular nature of the stadium keeping the sound in there, but it's also going to echo off the solid base of this stadium, since it's right in the hill. If this was hollow, if this was like on stands and things like that, like you see bleachers, it wouldn't have the same effect. But since it's built right into the hillside, it helps amplify and keep the sound in there. So these are engineering marvels that they put together back in the day. We'll see at Rome, they could basically take these and turn them into full circled coliseums and theaters. But that's Greek theater for you. So that ends this video.